On the banks of the Volga River in the year 922, a funeral tent stood heavy with silence. Inside, 6 warriors waited, their faces hidden in the half-dark. A young woman entered, her steps slow, her breathing uneven. Her name was Sigret, though no one outside the circle of her village would remember it. The Arab traveler watching from outside the tent, separated by only a sheet of fabric, would write down what he saw, but he would not include her name. In his chronicles she would be nothing more than the girl, a servant who had stepped forward to accompany her dead master into the afterlife. He would record the ritual but not the life. The ceremony followed a pattern. One warrior after another claimed his time with her. By the 4th, Sigret was whispering words in fractured Norse, a language she had learned during 2 years of captivity since raiders had torn her from her Slavic village. "I see him," she said to the air, her voice small, "my master calls me to his hall." But the warrior before her had no interest in her visions. Neither did the 5th. By the 6th, her words had stopped entirely. She no longer spoke of visions, no longer pretended to see anything beyond the suffocating space she was trapped in. In the corner, an old woman known as the Angel of Death prepared the tools that would guarantee the end, a rope that would strangle, a blade that would finish what the rope began. Outside, the gathered crowd sang louder, voices raised in ritual, their chanting designed to cover any noise from within. Within minutes, Sigret would be a body burning beside her master on the funeral ship, her life consumed in fire and smoke. Her end was called an honor. In reality, it was the final act of a system designed for women like her, a system not content with mere enslavement, but one that turned suffering into a structure, cruelty into ritual. The Vikings built an empire not only on swords and ships but on a machinery of human misery, particularly the misery of women. Centuries later, when stories of Viking raids reached monks, Byzantine historians, and Arab emissaries, they all described the same thing, not random brutality, but a relentless, organized exploitation. What they witnessed shocked even those who came from cultures familiar with slavery. And yet, over time, this truth was buried. What remains in popular imagination are tales of warriors, adventurers, and explorers, while the women who bore the true cost have been left nameless, their existence reduced to footnotes. But their stories remain in fragments. They can still be told. The first great warning came in the summer of 793, on the holy island of Lindisfarne off England's northern coast. The monastery stood in peace, its monks copying texts and singing prayers. That morning, Sister Aldred was in the scriptorium, her quill tracing letters of scripture. By nightfall, she was crouching in a granary, dust stinging her eyes, listening to the clash of iron and the cries of men and women. Through the cracks of the wooden storehouse, she saw strangers with axes and shields dividing the captives into groups. Her friend, Bridge, with auburn hair that gleamed in morning light, was dragged screaming across the ground. Her beauty, which had seemed a gift in cloistered peace, marked her for a different fate here. The Vikings separated the women like farmers sorting livestock, the young and beautiful in one group, the sturdy in another, the elderly left to die on the spot. Aldred felt a hand seize her arm, pulling her into the line. She had been a nun since the age of 14, had dedicated 12 years to prayer and service. Now, her life would be rewritten by men who did not even speak her language. The voyage across the sea redefined despair. 40 women crammed into a space built for half that number, bodies pressed together in darkness, breathing air thick with rot and salt. For 2 days they were given no food. Their only water came when waves crashed over the deck, and they licked the wet planks like animals. By the 5th day 2 had died, their corpses thrown into the sea without ceremony. By the 8th day, Aldred had stopped praying. God, she thought, was far away from this wooden coffin sliding across endless water. When the ship reached Norway, the division began. The raid leader took 6 women for himself, including Bridge. His warriors chose in order of their status and bravery. Aldred was handed to a farmer named Gunnar, who needed field workers. She watched Bridge taken toward the chieftain's hall and thought perhaps her friend's fate was kinder. She was wrong. Aldred would grind grain until her hands curled into claws, until her back bent permanently from carrying loads meant for beasts. She would die in that condition, her body worn out like a broken tool. Bridge lasted only months in the chieftain's hall before being sold eastward, absorbed into the vast slave networks that reached from Iceland to Constantinople. She vanished, like so many others, into silence. This was not chaos. It was a method. A raid on a Frankish village illustrates the pattern. The settlement still smoked from fire when Chieftain Ragnar Ironhand walked among the captives. His men had arranged the women into rows, 200 kneeling in mud, waiting to be classified. With practiced precision, Ragnar separated them into 3 groups. The first, laborers. Older women, or those showing signs of hard lives, destined for fields, mills, or households. They would work until their bodies broke. Marie, a mother of 4 whose husband had been cut down before her eyes, was placed here. Within hours she was set to a millstone, grinding grain until her hands bled. She would repeat that motion every day until her body failed 8 years later. The second group, breeders. Young women with strong bodies, capable of bearing children. Isabel, just 16, was placed here. Within a year she would give birth to her first child, a son who would inherit her status as property. Over the next decade, she would bring 7 more into the world, all taken from her, all raised not as her children but as new slaves for the household. The third, the special group. The beautiful, the noble, the very young. Marguerite, with striking features even in tears, was placed here. She was bathed, fed, and trained to present herself in ways that appealed to foreign buyers. She would be sold not in Norway, but in Constantinople or Baghdad, where her red hair and pale skin would fetch a price high enough to rival gold. Ragnar's method was repeated across Europe. The Vikings could estimate a woman's age from her teeth, her fitness from her hands, her reproductive value from her hips. They knew which ethnicities fetched higher prices in which markets: Slavic women in Byzantium, Irish women in Iceland, Frankish women in Ireland. A woman who could weave was worth far more than one who could not. One who could read or write, rarer still, could be sold for extraordinary sums to wealthy households. This was not random plunder. It was industrialized human trafficking. The markets grew into great engines of suffering. Dublin, once an Irish town, became the western hub of this commerce. Its auction block rose 15 feet, high enough for hundreds of buyers to see. Women were displayed naked, their lineage and qualities shouted in multiple languages: Norse, Irish, Latin, Arabic. A princess could command a fortune. A commoner might sell for only a few coins. Records describe one Irish noblewoman, Orlath, sold in Dublin for 24 marks of silver. The buyer, a trader specializing in high-value captives, transported her eastward, down the rivers of Russia, until she reached Baghdad. There she became one of countless exotics in the households of wealthy men. Her story was only one among thousands, each transaction reducing a human life to a commodity. Markets like Hedeby in Denmark operated with bureaucratic precision. Women arrived in chains, each given a number painted on her shoulder. Traders recorded their age, origin, and skills as though cataloging goods. Coffles of 50 women might begin in Ireland, chained by iron collars, and end months later in the markets of Kiev or Constantinople. Along the way, some would die of disease, some would kill themselves, some would be sold at smaller markets. Of the 50, perhaps a dozen might survive the full journey to Baghdad. The Norse had created something new, a continent-spanning network of human trafficking, efficient enough to rival anything Rome had once built and cruel enough to anticipate the Atlantic trade centuries later. Laws ensured the system endured. In Iceland, the Grágis Code reduced enslaved women to property so completely that their suffering ceased to matter legally. A thrall woman could not testify, could not refuse, could not own. Her body was her master's to use, to lend, to rent, to dispose of. Her children inherited her chains. If she was killed, the crime was not murder but property damage. Compensation was paid not for her life but for her owner's loss. These were not abstractions. They were lived realities. In one case, a woman named Asa was killed during a dispute between two men. The legal question was not her death, but her market value. 8 marks of silver. No more. The laws even formalized the practice of lending women to guests. A morning gift, they called it, as casual as offering a cup of ale. Refusal was impossible. Children born from such arrangements belonged to the woman's master, their paternity irrelevant. Inheritance laws bound families into perpetual servitude. A free man's child with a thrall woman was still a slave, unless the owner agreed to manumit, a rare act requiring full payment of their value. Generations remained in bondage, each child a new link in the chain. Ritual cloaked cruelty in religion. Funeral sacrifices like cigarettes were not isolated. Archaeological evidence reveals multiple women burned alongside chieftains in ship burials. Chronicles describe ceremonies in which 1, 5, or more women were strangled and stabbed to accompany a dead man into the afterlife. The crowd celebrated these deaths as sacred, the women transformed into eternal servants. At least those deaths were swift. The living endured far longer. Some were broken in spirit, some resisted in small ways, and some chose death rather than another day in chains. Women threw themselves into Icelandic lava flows or hot springs. Others drowned themselves in the ocean, seeking release in waters that had brought them there. And still, resistance flared. Women poisoned their masters with herbs, set slave markets on fire, killed infants rather than allow them to inherit slavery. Some endured years in their captors' beds only to strike when trust was greatest. Others sabotaged food or tools, spread false information, or taught their children forbidden songs and stories to keep some part of their old selves alive. Their resistance rarely changed the system, but it showed that even in the darkest conditions, the will to fight remained. By the numbers, the scale was immense. Historians estimate that more than 500,000 women were taken by Norse raiders between the late 8th and 11th centuries. Genetic studies confirm it. In Iceland, the male line is predominantly Scandinavian, but the female line is overwhelmingly Celtic, Irish and Scottish. These statistics are not abstractions. They are proof of mass abduction, forced reproduction, and entire populations reshaped by violence. Every Viking ship displayed in a museum once carried women in its hold. Every gold piece admired in exhibitions was likely purchased with silver earned from selling captives. Every saga that celebrates a hero glides past the silent presence of women grinding grain, bearing children, dying unnamed. Viking achievements, exploration, settlement, wealth, were built on a foundation of female suffering. Yet their stories were erased. The chronicles mention them only as property. Archaeology reveals shackles and mass graves but not the names of those who wore them. What remains is absence, silence, the deliberate forgetting of women whose humanity was stripped away by the very society that depended on them. And still, they endure. Their DNA remains in millions of people. Their resilience is found in whispered songs that survived, in hidden acts of resistance, in the fragments of chronicles where their shadows can still be glimpsed. Sigrid died on the Volga in 922, strangled and stabbed, her body burned to accompany a man who had owned her in life and would own her in death. She was 19. She had a family once, in a village that no longer exists. She had a name that went unrecorded. But she was real. She lived. She suffered. She died. So did hundreds of thousands of others. Their stories were silenced. Their names are forgotten. But they were the foundation of Viking wealth, the fuel of Viking power, the hidden cost of Viking glory. They deserved more than silence. They deserved more than erasure. The least we can do is speak of them now. To remember that they were not objects, not background figures, but people whose lives were stolen to build an empire. The fire on the Volga reduced Sigrid to smoke. The crowd dispersed, satisfied that their chieftain had reached Valhalla. But she had been more than an offering. She had been a daughter. She might have been a wife or mother in freedom. Instead, she was Ash. Her name was nearly lost. Her story was almost erased. Almost.